So we're going to begin Activity 71. I think this is important to understand this material. It's not merely history, because we now in 2013, when I'm taping this, are experiencing an ongoing economic downturn that started in fall 2008, as I recall. And the way in which to respond to an economic downturn is disputed. It's good to bring in historical examples to see what worked, what didn't work, and how that might be applicable to the problems we're facing today. So I think the Great Depression and the New Deal are a great case study, not only for the purpose of understanding the constitutional changes, but also the role of government and what we need to do when there's an economic downturn, because that's a very practical, important question. So Activity 71 begins with the verdict of Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury under Franklin Roosevelt. And you can see that he has very strong doubts that what they did was effective. In fact, he's quite certain it was not effective, and what they did was to try to have the federal government spend a lot of money and have lots of programs, thinking that that government spending would get the U.S. economy out of its downturn. But he, from the perspective of 1939, after the Depression had been around for a while, says, we have tried spending money. We have never spent this much money before, he says, but we have just as much unemployment as when we started and a lot of debt to boot. So the verdict here seems to be government spending is not the way out of a downturn. So what is? So we're going to, in this activity, look at an example of something that worked and compare it to what the presidents did during the Depression, and also what we're doing now as well. So it's important to see, as we look at that first table in Activity 71, that you have a stock market crash in 1929, and before we're done, we'll talk about what the causes might have been of that crash. But then notice a year later, you have 9% unemployment. And if you compare this to actually, I'm going down to letter A now, I see. I think the point of that top table, we'll go into more of the details in a moment, but that top table is just to show that whatever it is that Franklin Roosevelt was doing did not get us out of the Depression. That's the point of this first table in Activity 71. Under Hoover, things spiral downward to the point where you have 25% unemployment in 1933. And after Roosevelt's in there, it goes down a bit from there, but by 1939, when Morgenthau was speaking, you're still at 17% unemployment. 1938 is 19% unemployment, which is extremely bad. We complain when it's much lower than that, although the figures right now might not be as accurate as far as who's being counted, but just leaving that aside, I want you to see that if you've learned that the policies and approaches of Franklin Roosevelt got us out of the Depression, this table makes it clear that's not the case. Then you have the quotation from Lawrence Reed that historically, prior to 1929, when there was an economic downturn, it lasted for a couple of years and it was over. In very rare cases, and at worst, 4 years, but that was, as I said, rare. So, what did these presidents do, Hoover and Roosevelt, as opposed to Harding, is what we're going to look at in letter A. President Harding has a bad reputation. I'm not sure it's well-deserved if you look at the chart under letter A. In 1921, with Harding as president, there was 12% unemployment after the economic downturn that followed World War I, which is worse than the economic downturn following the stock market crash. In 1930, there was 9% unemployment, so I don't know if people are aware that there was an even more severe downturn in 21. Now, as far as how Harding approached it and the federal government along with President Harding, if you look at the next table, in 1921, federal spending was at the level of $6.4 billion following World War I. Now, over the next few years, 1921, 1922, 1923, you see by the time you get to 1923, the federal government has cut spending by half, from $6.4 billion to a little more than $3.2 billion. So we're going to take this as a model of economic recovery, because you can see in 1921 we had 12% unemployment, but 2 years later we had 4%. So you have a great deal of recovery back to what one would consider full employment in 1923. So we're looking in letter A at a recipe for economic recovery. So that recipe begins with cutting federal spending a lot, by half in this case. Then for federal taxes, it starts out at $6.7 billion in 1920, down to $4 billion in 1923. That is reduced by a little more than a third. So you're also going to cut federal taxes, but not overly severely, because you want to start paying down your debt. You can see that in 1920 we had a federal debt of $24 billion. It's paid down to $22 billion in 1923. So we have paid down our debt. So I'm going to suggest the recipe for economic recovery is exactly what the federal government did here: cutting federal spending, cutting federal taxes, cutting federal debt. My understanding is that previous to this, this was just the typical way governments responded to an economic downturn. By when there's a downturn, there's going to be less revenue, so you need to cut spending, cut taxes, etc. And this apparently has the effect of letting the economy recover. More money is left in the hands of private individuals, private companies, and recovery takes place, although those 1 or 2 years may be difficult as it's happening. Then letter B, you can see a break from the past. That's going to be standard for our study of this period of the 30s and following, of the progressives. There's a sense that there's a better way of doing things. Why even have any suffering at all when the federal government can just get involved and get us very quickly out of a recovery, out of a downturn. So in letter B, you can see President Hoover taking the opposite approach of what was done previously. He increased government spending right away, and then as there was a concern that not enough money was coming in through taxes, there was an increase in taxes, and the federal government was running a deficit during this period. So this contradicts the idea that President Hoover was a laissez-faire, do-nothing president. That's not the case. He did the exact opposite of what Harding is. Harding is the example of a president and a federal government that does nothing to respond to an economic downturn except kind of get out of the way. Now here, you have Hoover increasing federal spending, increasing federal taxes, increasing federal debt, with Roosevelt just taking this and doing it even more. So you have Roosevelt increasing federal spending, or the federal government under Roosevelt increasing its spending by 83%. Debt rockets by 73%, according to Reed. High tax increases, as you can see from letter C. So again, Roosevelt is just doing this even more. Now, this doesn't seem to work. You don't get economic recovery with this. In fact, it may well be that what the federal government was doing during this period was preventing economic recovery from happening, along with a couple of other things that the federal government was doing that hindered recovery. But if that's true, then the federal government itself caused the Great Depression, and that would be significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Great Depression is often used as a justification for increasing the power of the federal government beyond the limits of 1/8, because people say it was necessary. But what if it wasn't necessary and actually was detrimental? That would actually justify keeping the federal government within its limits. Also, just from the point of view of what do you do in an economic downturn, this indicates that this may well be the wrong way to go, and this is the right way to go to bring about recovery. This would be of great concern to us in the year 2013, because from the very start, at the end of President Bush's presidency, and then during the first term of President Obama and beyond, we've been following this approach. Now, if all of this is true, then that explains why we have not experienced real recovery. There may be some things being done in the short term to keep things afloat, but we're not experiencing the recovery we had hoped for, and this may go some way to explaining why. That's, again, something for you all to reflect on and consider. Now, in letter D, this is just a book I recommend if you want to go into this in detail. It's a somewhat difficult book by Benjamin Anderson called Economics and the Public Welfare. But he uses as an example this historical period from November 1933 to September 1934 as kind of a case study to show in a narrow time frame that government spending does not bring about recovery, although it may bring about some stimulation at first, as he points out, and I put this in the notes, that you can have a business rally that goes up from 72 index number to 86 after 6 months, but then you follow it a year later and the economy is worse off than before the spending. So this small little case study validates what Morgenthau saw. So at the beginning of the activity, we're just where we started, and all we have is a lot of debt, which is maybe something we could say in 2013. So again, this is just something to reflect on as to the direction that we need to be heading now. So next we'll go on to activity 72 to look at another cause of the depression.